I had just come back from a camping trip in the Appalachian Mountains and decided to go back into the woods to find a few more mushrooms I'd been collecting. I had been in the same place the year before. I had a general idea of where everything should be. But I decided to go with my gut feeling. The woods were thick and hard to walk through, and I was sweating pretty bad despite the cool temperature. I came to a small clearing and saw a small tree with a white trunk. I thought it was birch, but it had white bark and it was smooth. I thought that's a strange tree for this area. There's nothing else like it around. I even noted that the base of the tree had been charred black from a fire, along with the white. There were no other trees around it, and so I started to walk past the tree. That's when I noticed something white on the ground. I thought, that's weird. I didn't see that before. I turned around to look again, and that's when I see this white hand on the ground. At first, it looked kind of like a paw, but the closer I inspected it, I could see 2 fingers and a thumb. I froze and began to panic. I looked back at the tree and looked at the hand on the ground. I looked back at the tree again, then at the hand. It was some sort of mixture of like an animal paw and a hand. Like there's some sort of half-breed or something. Freaked me out, man. I ran out of the woods as fast as I could. I went to the police, and they said they would send an officer to go take a look. But you know how that goes. I never heard anything, and I have no idea what happened. It was very scary. Also, there's a story I'd heard from a friend. This friend of a friend said that he was walking along a trail and actually saw a dead body hanging from a tree. He said he didn't look at it too closely but ran away. I have no idea if his story is true, but that's scary too. We were camping out one night. My family had been near a deep wooded area for the past 5 hours. My father had just finished chopping wood and was walking to our tent to go to sleep. I was sitting by the fire when we both hear a loud thump coming from the woods. My dad and I both looked, and we both sat frozen in place. He sat there as I was frozen solid too. We get this creepy feeling that comes over us as we look and peer off into the woods. It was hard to tell myself it was just a deer or maybe another animal. I tried convincing myself that I was safe. I walk over to my father, tapping him on the shoulder. When I tapped him, he jumped, asked me what was wrong, and I said, "I thought you heard that too." And he was like, "I did. Keep paying attention." So we're both sitting there looking around. We heard another noise. This time, it sounded like somebody stepping on a branch. We heard yet another noise, this time to our right. We both looked into the woods and saw a tall man figure. As it turns out, it wasn't actually a man, but some strange dark figure walking toward our campfire. Now, both of us were completely terrified as this figure approached the trees right by our tent. That's when my dad and I both horrifyingly noticed it had no face. It had a dark hood on, and it stood at about 6 feet tall. I could not see its face. I could not even tell if it was a man or a woman. I was just too terrified. I was frozen there. This thing casually stood maybe no more than 10 feet away. Stood there watching me and my father. At least I think it was. It didn't have a face, so I don't know. Then it just kind of evaporated. My dad looked at me, and he was just as panicked as I was. He stood up very slowly, walked over to the tent. He told me to follow him. I had to fight every nerve in my body just to be able to stand up and follow. But as soon as I did, I rushed in that tent and I curled up in my sleeping bag. My father did too. We're very freaked out. We had no idea what we just saw. The morning came and we hardly slept. So we packed up our tent and headed for home. I told my dad What do you think that was? Because I'm not sure. We talked about it a bit, but I think it was a ghost. He is not so sure. We didn't really talk about it much after that. When we got home, we both told my mother. She didn't believe us, I could tell, even though she never flat out denied it or said it was a lie. She just didn't say much, but I know her demeanor. As for me and my dad, we haven't been camping back to that same spot since this happened. I was walking back to my car in an area of the woods that I had been to many times before. It was just a 1-mile hike from the parking lot, actually, and it was about 6:30 p.m. at the time. I was walking because I had just finished a 7-mile run. I was a little more than exhausted, and at this point, kind of dragging my feet. It was dusk, and it hadn't quite gotten too dark yet. That's when I heard the sound of something following me in the woods, paralleling me, just beyond the trees. I turned to look, and I'm pretty sure I saw a Bigfoot about 50 feet away from me. It was on the side of the trail and was standing on the side of a small hill. It was looking right over at me, but at the same time, appeared to be looking at something on the ground. I was too in shock to look at it for too long. It was about 6 feet tall and had dark brown hair. I knew what it was right away. I mean, there's nothing else out here that looks like that. It had to be a Bigfoot. It was crazy. It just kept glaring at me, and it kind of had a point on its head. It then kept looking down at the ground, and it had something small in its hands, like maybe a dead rabbit or something. It stared at me for a few more moments, staying totally still, before it just randomly turned off and ran into the woods behind it. That was enough for me. I took off running, towards my car. I didn't stop running until I got to my car, which was about a half-mile down the trail at this point. I got in my car and drove off as fast as I could. But this would spark a long and endearing relationship with cryptids, and Bigfoot specifically. I was scared at first, but now I'm very intrigued in their existence. I've heard some other eyewitnesses report from people in the area. There was actually an incident back in the summer of 1983, where a truck driver was driving down a logging road in the area. He says that he came across a family of Bigfoot. He said that they were crossing the road in front of him. When he stopped to see what they were, they all ran. He said he saw at least 4 of them. They were all very large and running fast. He was kind of shocked and wasn't sure what to do. This is only the second sighting I know of in this area. I had been hiking and running in this area now for several years. It's a very remote spot, and is far away from any main town or civilization. I've heard of other sightings in the area, and there are wild black bears around, but nothing like the Bigfoot I saw. I know I saw one. It was with my own 2 eyes. There's no denying that. In the mid-1990s, I joined as a member of an occult group in New York City. It was a small offshoot of the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is one of the oldest existing occult groups in the world. We were a coven of about a dozen people who met weekly at each other's apartments to try and learn and master the fundamentals of ritual magic. We were taught how to evoke spirits and deities, and were given instruction on how to work magic. Everything was kept secret, and we were blindfolded when we were taken out to be initiated. All I knew was that the head of our order was a man who called himself Bill. He told us that he would learn a lifetime's worth of magical knowledge in just a few years. He said that he was a direct descendant of Aleister Crowley, and told us that he was the only one of his father's sons who was worthy to take over the order. We were required to take a vow of secrecy and had to submit to a blood oath. The ritual that I saw was held deep in the woods of northern New Jersey. It was taking place in a clearing that was completely surrounded by thick, dense woods. There was a pentagram painted on the ground. The ritual was led by a man who called himself Osiris. He claimed to be the reincarnation of the Egyptian god Osiris. He was dressed in a white robe. There was a fire burning in the center of the pentagram, and there were about 10 of us in attendance, including myself. They were all wearing robes. Me too. At first, I thought the ritual was just for fun. Like, a seance. I had been to a couple of those before, but when Osiris then cut his arm with a ceremonial dagger and let his blood drip down into the fire, I began to realize this was far more serious. Then he cut his other arm and let the blood drip down into the fire. He was still chanting, and then he made a motion with his hand, and the fire leapt up into the air. The flames were burning so high that I thought they would set the nearby trees on fire. He did the same hand motion again, and the fire died back down into the pit. Next, he took a bottle of wine from one of the other people in the circle and drank from it. Then, he poured some of the wine from one of the other people on the ground in the circle. That's when he began to chant in another language. He was repeating the same word over and over. I had heard him say that he was a magician, and that magic was his language. He also said that magic was the only language that certain spirits could understand. I had been told that the spirits that were going to evoke were powerful demons that would appear in the bodies of dead. I had never seen or spoken to Osiris before this night. I did not know that he was capable of summoning such powerful spirits. I was scared. I was afraid that he might be summoning something that would be too strong for him to control. Just then, some of our trances were broken by the sounds of something large moving in the woods around us. That's when we heard growling. Something was being summoned. Osiris, completely unfazed, continued to chant. Then he motioned with his hand, and this group of large, black, humanoid cats ran into the clearing. I had never seen anything like them before. They were like part man, part panther. They were walking on their hind legs. They were disgusting looking. Osiris informed us to not be alarmed, that he controlled them. They moved in the circle of light towards Osiris, and that these beings, he had full control over them. He waved his hands in a strange motion again over these things and began to speak in a totally different language again. They were all snarling and just nasty, evil things. He said what sounded like a shouting command, and they all departed from the light. After this, Osiris motioned again, and the fire leapt up into the air. Then, he did something that really scared me. He picked up a dagger and began to draw a symbol in the air that I had never seen before. He spoke in that of another language. I heard one of the other people in the circle speak up and say that that was the symbol of a very powerful demon. Osiris then motioned as if he was pushing something away from him with his hands. Then he motioned as if he was pulling something towards him. He kept repeating this motion over and over. He said that he was binding the spirit to the symbol. He spoke those other words again, and he had a look of power and determination on his face. Now he was sweating and breathing heavily. Suddenly, I heard a sound in the woods, like some very large animal growling. Then I heard something walking through the woods. I was sure that it was the demon. Osiris said that it was coming. He said that it was the only one that was actually able to break through the barrier that was placed around the ritual circle. I was sure that everything was going to turn out okay, but I had no idea how that demon was going to be so powerful. This thing came into the light. It was this huge black dog. It looked like a grotesque werewolf. It was growling and drooling and making all sorts of nasty chittering. It had glowing red eyes. I had never seen anything so terrifying in my life. Every inch of it just looked evil and mean. Its eyes were so red that they looked like a pair of glowing hot red coals. It was going towards Osiris obediently, as if he had full control over it. He then motioned as if he was pushing away from it again. He motioned as if he was pulling it towards him. He said that he was binding the demon again to the symbol, and repeated the other words. Then he said something in the demon's language, a different language. The demon then began to circle the fire. It was now snarling and growling. It had this really evil look on its face. Honestly, it was terrifying. It was so evil that it was beyond description. I was now starting to shake. The others were still in their trance. Osiris makes yet another motion, and the demon stops moving. It was now still. Now it was growling and drooling, staring at all of us. It looked at each one of us, one by one, trying to intimidate us. Then it looks at Osiris, and he spoke to it in its own language. The demon responded with a grunt. He said something else to it. It responded to that. I began to feel controlled by how evil it was, like its evilness was a tidal wave. Osiris is something else to the demon. I felt that this thing was so evil and so powerful that I was losing my own willpower. Just then, Osiris made another gesture, and the demon began to now move. We were all in a trance and could not really move. It circled the fire again, and then it just kind of dissipated into the darkness around the fire. Osiris spoke in more low-toned words and claimed the ritual was nearing end. We were to go through one last part. Osiris then went around to each of us and placed his hand on a person's forehead. He would chant something and they would fall over, rendering them unconscious. He went around and did this to each of us, including me. Before, he informed us that we would awake in our beds and the ritual would be sealed. We would now be a part of the night. After I awoke in my bed, just as he had said, I felt different. I felt like something was taken from inside of me. And a lot of things in my life after that started to rapidly go downhill. I lost my job. Family members died that I was close with in just a few years' time. I even went through a few psychotic episodes and nearly committed suicide on at least 3 different occasions. Now, I'm doing much better, but I've never felt the same since. I got out of that cult in 1999. I had to move all the way across the country and change my name so they could not trace me. But now with 2020 going on, I'm just like everybody else. I'm trying to survive. Anyway, just be careful with what you involve yourself with. In the summer of 1972, I was just in my mid-teens. My family was living in a small town in the northern part of the country. It was a nice, beautiful rural area, and there was a farmer across the street from us. And sometimes, the grass would be mowed. I don't know if that was part of the farmer's regular routine or what, or if he was just trying to keep the grass mowed down for some other reason, besides maintenance. There was a large field behind this house. To the right of the house was woods. To the left was a small creek. Directly behind the house was a large hill. That also went up another hill, and on top of that was a small rock quarry. So, one night, I was sitting on the front porch, and I saw something. It was gliding across the field, gray-white in color, and looked kind of like a huge, shapeless sheet. I could see through it. It was translucent. It appeared to be moving very fast, and I could even see the grass moving as it passed over it. It was traveling in a straight line, and just above the grass, about a foot or two off the ground, from what I could recall. I called for my mother, and she came out to the porch. She watched it for a while and then went back inside. I went back to watching it, and it was still traveling in a straight line. It was almost to the edge of the woods when it suddenly stopped. It just stopped dead and hovered. I watched it for about a minute. Then it began moving again. It glided through the woods and over the creek. It was still moving, and still moving very fast. Then, it disappeared fully behind the hill. This went on again for the next several years. The same thing happening, almost every night. Well, eventually I moved away and grew up. I got married, and I never really forgot about this. I have always thought about it. I never told anybody about this, though, until just a few years ago. I told my wife and some close friends. I have never been able to figure out what it was. It was a very odd-looking thing. Now, I'm not normally a ghost believer, or into the paranormal, or anything like that. But I certainly cannot explain away what I saw that night in the field. And call it a trick of the eyes or what, but it definitely freaked me out. I was hiking in the woods of western Michigan with my dog, a German Shepherd Labrador mix, who, at the time, was also my best friend. I came across a very large, thin man lying on the ground. There was a good distance between us, so I tried to make out if it was an injured hiker, or maybe a deceased person's. As I got closer, I saw he was tall and very thin, with unnaturally long, thin arms and legs. He appeared to be naked and had very pale skin, with dark hair. Then I could see his eyes, and they were bright blood red. Now I'm about 20 feet away, and I see all these details, and he immediately shoots up off the ground and begins walking towards me on all fours. Just as I thought this was a sickly man, as I got closer to him, I realized this was not a man at all. I didn't know this at the time, but I believe now, looking back, this was a Wendigo. I knew it instantly. I was very shocked, and it was so sudden. I didn't have time to react to him jumping up. I only knew about this being a Wendigo because I'd heard countless stories about Wendigos and what they looked like. I just knew that whatever he was, or it was, I knew it was very bad. I knew I had to get out of there right away. So I picked up my dog in my arms and began to run. I ran as fast as I could, hoping to get away. I then ran into a small clearing and then turned around to see if he was following me. I did this, and I was worried about him chasing. Quickly, this thing is zooming through the woods, very twitchy and stiff. Luckily, I was able to get away from him carrying my dog, and he disappeared. But, that was easily one of the scariest experiences I have ever had in the woods. Never had that happen before in my life. Back when I was 19, I encountered a strange being in the wilderness. I can't begin to tell you what it was because, simply, I don't know. But I can confidently say it wasn't your typical animal. This was something else altogether. I don't want to encounter it again. That much I can tell you. I was walking past the edge of the woods, near the local library. Now, this is a route I often took to walk back to my house, which was no more than 20 minutes away. I see this human-like figure, and I thought I was hallucinating, so I walked back to look closer. It was very tall and had a very pale white body. Its torso was very muscular too, and it had a human face with eyes that were totally black. As soon as I saw it, I got this strange feeling like it was not a human being, but maybe a bad spirit. Then, it sees me in 1 second, drops down all fours, and begins spider crawling towards me. I was screaming and running for my life at this point. Whatever the heck this thing was chasing me. I think it was the sheer adrenaline rush that got me home. I'm no athlete, but I was allowed to sprint for such a long ways that I could have never dreamed of. This is my story. I don't know what that thing was, but I hope I never have to see it again. This story was shared to me by a close, trusted friend, whom I've known most of my life. For a period of time, we grew apart and did not talk, the same time that this happened to him. But we're close again now in recent years. We both used to live in Northern California, but I ended up moving. I live in Arizona now. But he has had several encounters with what are commonly referred to as Skinwalkers or werewolves, I guess. I tried and do a lot of research on the subject, and have come to the conclusion that these are not your average Dogman. They're a lot more different than that. They're human in shape, but their skulls are different, which is why people think of them as different. And they can also jump from tree to tree. Their eyes are completely black, and they don't have a nose. They have this weird human mouth that is more like a beak, but they're not birds. They have really long, sharp claws on their hands and toes. In one encounter, he felt like he was being watched during his entire walk home from the bus stop, when he has to walk through a portion of woods to get to his next bus. I'm not talking about a school bus, by the way. He was riding the city bus to go, I think, to his job. I can't remember. He was in the woods when he heard a rustling to his left. He looks over and sees something that was definitely not human crawling out of the brush. His eyes locked onto this thing, and this thing let out this horrible screeching sound, and it sounded like it was trying to speak to him. He turned his back on it and ran. Apparently, he tells me he ran so fast he tore ligaments in his leg muscles. About a month or two goes by and he just can't get over what happened. So he stupidly decides he can go find this thing again. Nearby, right where this happened, was a small cave down in a very small ravine. He knew it was probably an old black bear den, and he convinced himself that that would be a great place to start. He went down there and went into the den to see if he can find any clues. The only thing he found besides leaves and dirt were old beer cans and trash. Then, he heard a louder sound just outside the cavern. He looks over and hears a strange noise, like a humming sound, but said it sounded mechanical. Now, as soon as he hears this, he began to get a really bad feeling in the pit of his stomach. Like all of a sudden he needs to leave now, and not waste any more time. He got out of this small cave, looked around and did not see anything, but continued to hear this low, strange humming noise that he just could not place. As he's walking away, he hears a loud crack, and it sounds like a big branch breaking. He looks over and sees the same pale white creature, but crawling down a tall tree. He froze up and this thing let out a screech. Now he turned around and started running. He can hear this thing running after him, kind of making a smacking sound. Now, he was running through this different part of woods, running for his life. It was much thicker, so it was harder to traverse through. He was so scared now that he did not even look back. He did not recognize the forest that he was running into, and it was all unfamiliar. This thing was following him, jumping back and forth in the trees. He would look over and see it on top of a tree, then hear the sound of it jumping from one tree to another. He would look over to another tree and see it on that one. He didn't know which way to go because he didn't know where he was anymore. He just kept running and running. So he came to a clearing and it was a pond. He thought about going in but decided not to because he did not know what was in there. He ran around the pond and saw a side path to his left. He ran into it, hoping that this thing wouldn't go that way. The path was a dead end. He was stuck. He heard this thing coming closer and closer. He heard it then jump down and onto the ground. And now, he wasn't sure what to do. He was concerned that this was a dead end, and now that he was cornered, he started to cry. He closed his eyes and clenched his teeth. waiting for the end. He heard this thing get closer and closer. He just knew deep down that this thing was going to kill him. So he falls down to his knees and just starts praying without ceasing. This goes on for maybe a minute or two, and then he opens his eyes up and this thing is gone. He doesn't waste a second. He scrambles up and he clambers up the side of the hill and eventually reaches a very curvy road where he waves down a driver and explains that he had gotten lost out here, purposefully not telling them what had just happened. It turns out, he was only roughly a mile or less away from where he needed to be. I'm not sure if this was a crawler or what that he experienced, but it's some really scary stuff, that's for sure. I was deer hunting in the mountains of western South Carolina for the first time in about 3 years. I had been drawn to this area and time for a number of reasons which I will not go into. Suffice to say that it was a very dark place and time. I parked my truck on a gravel road and I knew it would lead me into the forest. Now, I had some people tell me that there's a cool small cabin that I need to check out. It's been abandoned, but just a cool place to go see. So, I started walking back in that direction. It was late and getting darker. I was carrying a small backpack. I had food, a flashlight, matches, a knife, a bottle of bourbon, cigars, and a gun. I walked about a mile in when I came to the place where the path entered the woods. The deep woods, I should say. I knew that there was this cabin that people had talked about, but it was a little bit more deeper into the woods. I should go check it out. I was all down for urban exploration, so I thought, hey, why not? I was already headed there anyway. This was just a short distance in the woods on the left, but I also knew the woods were only getting thicker and more wild. So I decided to walk around the perimeter of these woods and approach the cabin closer and closer. As I walked and got closer, I was startled by this huge, angry raccoon. It was enormous and seemed to be pissed that I was invading its space, but I walked away from it. It turned and disappeared, so I kept walking. It was a strange-acting raccoon, I'll say that. After a few moments, I noticed there was no longer this feeling of feeling scared. I think it's because I could see this fairly large old cabin in the distance, and I could see that it was built a long time ago. It had no front door on it, and looked to be a little run down and ransacked. Spray painted on the outside, of course. And I saw the occasional beer can lying around. But as soon as I get near it, man, I just get this bad feeling that comes over me. So I take a step into the cabin, and immediately into a large room on the left. On the floor is a giant spray-painted pentagram on the ground, a ceremonial dagger, covered in blood, and a huge puddle of dried blood right on the ground. Immediately, my stomach sank, and I was just feeling that I needed to get out of there, and now. There was no more time for exploring and having fun. Initially, I was here to scout out for good tree stand spots, and this was just a little side trip. Now, it was all about escape. I walked out of the cabin and immediately headed back toward my truck. Now I was walking a little faster than normal, but I didn't feel like running. I didn't want to draw any attention to myself, in case there was others around who had ill intent. Besides, I knew that if I ran, I would be giving off the vibe that I was running because I was scared. And that is exactly what I was. I was scared. You don't ever want to be in the woods, alone at night by yourself, and scared. You're telling everything and everyone around you that you're vulnerable. I noticed that strange feeling that I was being watched too. I would look behind me from time to time and no one or nothing would be there. So I assumed it was my imagination, and I could not shake the feeling. So I did the next best thing besides running. Walked very, very fast. Of course, I was breathing heavy now, nearly running. I was getting more and more panicked. losing control over my emotions, and I got farther and farther away from my truck, it seems. Even though I was maybe a couple hundred yards away, I had to go through a small section of woods that was a little bit thicker than the rest. Now I was forced to walk a bit slower, completely covered in hot sweat. My heart was racing out of my chest, and I could feel my pulse in my head. The hair on the back of my neck was now standing up. Then, I started seeing these large shadows darting all around me, and I heard demonic laughing. This was too much. I just tore through and got to my truck. Finally just left, altogether. I didn't even want to know what had been going on in that cabin. I live on a farm in the town of Beaver Creek, which is a small town on the coast of Northern California, off the Oregon state line. I've lived here now for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I can't explain it. I don't know if this has happened before. I was walking out in the woods behind my house with my dog. The woods are thick and close to my house. I walk my dog out there every day, but when I walked out there this day, I saw a strange sighting. A circle of dead deer. There were several dead deer on the outside of the circle and 2 dead on the inside. They were all facing the same way, and it's like they were trying to escape something. The circle was maybe 50 feet in diameter, and they were all covered in flies. I don't know what killed the deer. There was no blood. They were all stretched out with their back legs and front legs behind and in front of them. It made a circle with their corpses. The stench was terrible. I was so puzzled by what I was seeing, I decided to look closer and examine the scene. All the deer appeared to have died not long ago. No more than 12 hours, if I had to guess. There were no visible puncture, bite, bullet, stab, or any visible wounds of any kind that I could see. There was also no blood or any sign that these deer were injured or fatally killed. It looked as if literally about 15 deer congregated in a circle from head to butt and just lay down, stretched out their front and back legs, and died, all at the same time. These deer were also abnormally large. The doe were very large compared to my dog. Usually, doe are much smaller, but these were huge doe. The whole thing really crept me out because I had no clue what killed these deer and just left them here to rot. Why? What would do this? I wonder if this had possibly been the work of somebody who had maybe poisoned them and found their bodies and maybe put them in a circle for whatever reason. But none of it made sense. I just can't understand a purpose. So I called the sheriff's department, and they said they would send somebody to go look at it. I don't know if they really did, and I don't want to go back there now. It's just creepy vibes. I did not touch these deer, and I did not take any pictures. I just wanted to share my experience. This is not something I've ever seen before, and I don't know if you or anybody has any ideas about why these deer were here, or if they have seen anything like this before. I'd love to hear your speculation, though, as to what it could have been that killed these deer, or who set this up. I was out in the woods near my house, sitting down at the base of a tree. I was facing up the hill at about a 45-degree angle, facing the tree line. The sun had just set, so it was still pretty light outside. The woods are so dense in that area that it is extremely hard to see into them. So I was just sitting there enjoying the darkening sky in front of me, puffing on my tobacco pipe, like I try to make a ritual out of every evening. I'd been there for maybe 5 minutes at most, and I see this black shape moving throughout the trees a little ways away. I didn't get a chance to make out any details, but I could see it was massive, far bigger than any man or bear, and it was moving fast, from left to right, as if it were on a mission. I got to my feet by this time, and it was moving at a very brisk pace. So I stood up, turned around, and Now it was about 50 yards, moving quickly. I still could only faintly see a silhouette. But surprisingly, I wasn't frightened, just very intrigued. I was desperate to see what it was. I have never seen anything like this before. I was not sure if it was going to attack me or just continue to move throughout the woods, if I decided to pursue it. So I started to follow it. I lost it shortly thereafter and could not see it. So I kept trying to walk along the trail that it was on, but I saw nothing. I came to a clearing about 100 feet across, and I could tell something had gone through it. The only problem was, this was in the spring, and everything, all the foliage and plants had grown back in full force. The brush and briar bushes were so dense and thick, there's no way any man could just walk through. So I looked around for a while and kept walking. I was on the verge of giving up, and I saw this thing again in the woods, moving across the clearing. So I crouched down and watched it more. But because the sun was now setting, and this is a dark portion of woods anyway, it was getting dark very fast. And I figured if I didn't turn back around now, I'd be stuck out here alone at night, with no light. I was about to turn back when I heard a cracking sound. I looked up in response to the noise and could see this other large black shape in the trees, jumping from tree to tree, and then jumping down to the ground below. I watched it for about 10 more seconds before it disappeared. I have no idea what these were, and I will never forget this evening. I got back to my house and stayed inside the rest of the night. I don't even really know if I want to know what it was.
This was 1998 when this happened. An old friend of mine asked me to go camping with him. I hadn't been since I was about 12, so I agreed. It sounded fun, and I was excited all week leading up to the trip. I didn't get much sleep the night before because of it. He picked me up just after 5 a.m., and we drove 100 miles to the park. I managed to get a bit of sleep, so I felt a little better when we arrived. Then he dropped the bomb on me. We still had to walk another 2 hours to the campsite. I tried to talk him into choosing ones a little closer, but he swore I'd love it when we made it. With a heavy heart, I followed him. The first half hour wasn't that bad. Most of it was downhill. However, as more time passed, I became sluggish. Halfway there, we took a short break, but were back on the trail before I knew it. The second leg was a lot more uphill. It wasn't long until I was dragging again and not paying attention to where I was going. We arrived at a flat section and I was relieved. My friend was in the front row and somehow missed the trap, but I did not. All I remember was that 1 second. I was camping and clomping along and hitting the ground the next. The contact with the bottom of the hole jolted me awake, and the rush of adrenaline masked out most of the pain. As I stood up, my right leg buckled, and I dropped down onto a sharpened stick jutting out below me. Apparently, there were several more stakes in the bottom of a hole, but they had been knocked over, thankfully. When I looked down, I saw the bones sticking out of my skin. Instinctively, I pulled the stick from my leg, and the pain made me even queasier than I already was. I looked up to get an idea of where I was, and only saw blue sky edged by trees. I figured the hole was about 10 feet deep or more. It must have taken the idiots that dug it several days. I yelled up for my friend, only to see his laughing face greet me over the edge. He didn't know the extent of my injuries at the moment, but when I told him, the laughing stopped, and panic replaced it. I asked him what happened, and he told me it looked like some redneck poachers had dug some type of bear trap, and I'd fallen into it. I assumed he could simply reach down and pull me out, but that didn't work. So next, he attempted to reach me with the tree limb. This worked at first, but when I tried to stand up, the pain was far too severe. I couldn't put any weight on my right leg. It was obvious. I wasn't getting out of the hole without outside help. It was still early in the day, so I wasn't very concerned. I could hear my friend pacing around above and freaking out. So I called up to him in a calm voice and told him to go get help. The ranger station was only a little over half an hour back from where we came, He could easily get help and make it back to me with plenty of time before dark. Once he took off, I was left alone with nothing but the pain to occupy me. By now, it was coming in waves, and the accompanying nausea wasn't making it any better. Initially, I thought I could make a splint, but the moment I tried to tighten it down, I almost fainted. Leaving it alone seemed the wise decision. I put my head between my knees and waited for the sick, dizzy feeling to pass. Eventually, it did, and I tried to focus on other things. Singing worked for a while, that is, until I started hearing thunder and noticed the sky above me getting darker by the minute. Getting a little wet wasn't going to kill me, right? Perhaps I should have considered my circumstances before saying that. The rain was relatively light at first, but within minutes it was coming down in sheets. I was okay, until I began to notice the hole filling with water. My feet were already submerged by the time I realized I was in trouble. I clawed my way up the wall until I was standing, at least the best I was able, and started praying for it to stop. As the minutes passed, more of my body disappeared. After an hour, the storm began letting up, and I could relax. The water level was only about halfway at my shins, and I knew now, if I continued at that rate, help would be here before it even reached my waist. Unfortunately, it was just a lull in the storm. Soon enough, the rain was sheeting down again. The only positive about the whole thing was it had taken my mind off the pain in my leg. I tried to be upbeat, thinking back on funny jokes and movies. The next hour was the longest in my life. When help finally arrived, the rain had almost completely stopped. At the time, the ropes pulled me out. The water was just below my belt. Thinking about drowning to death in a little hole, out in the middle of nowhere, still gives me the willies. Once I was out of the hole, the ride to the hospital went by fast. After a surgery where I acquired some screws and a few plates, I was allowed to go home. The next 8 weeks on crutches would drag by, but I was happy to be alive. Broken leg or not. We never got to make up for the lost trip, but I have taken my kids out camping a few times in the years since. While it's on my mind, I may give my friend a ring. We haven't seen one another in a few years, and a camping trip might be the best way to catch up. I'll make sure to keep my eyes open this time. My life growing up was far from good. Rather than constant physical abuse, although there was that too, my parents ignored me most of the time. Both had drinking problems. My mom only worked part-time so she could, as she said, be there for her kid. But she really spent the majority of her free time in a bottle or bed. My dad was the main breadwinner, working as an over-the-road truck driver. He was away most of the time, leaving me alone to take care of myself. Our apartment was on the edge of town, surrounded by miles of forest. As long as I can remember, I was entranced by those woods. It wasn't long before I was spending my days exploring them. My love of nature only grew from there. I soon realized neither of my parents were paying attention to my comings and goings. So, I began camping out in the woods overnight, here and there, just to see if I'd be missed. But as I'd figured, I was not. From there, I began spending weeks at a time camping throughout the vast forest. We all know good things must end, and one morning, I was caught walking out of the woods by my father. He'd just arrived back from the time on the road. It was early, and he was livid to see his 12-year-old son walk out of the woods at 5 in the morning on a school day. In addition to hiding, I got an earful from both of them. This didn't stop me from returning, though. After laying low around home for a week, I waited for my dad to leave and my mom to get drunk. When I was sure she was asleep, I fled back to my real home. I would slip back in early morning, every morning, prior to school without anybody noticing. It didn't take long for things to go back to the way they had been before. If I wasn't at school, I was roaming in the woods. I mentioned before I had a series of camps throughout the forest. Early on, I realized I was sharing my getaway with others. Among these interlopers were small groups of homeless people. Probably way before I came along, they'd used the woods as a place to camp and drink, away from the prying eyes of the public and police. I made the mistake of staying in the same place too long on one occasion, and almost got assaulted because of it. After that run-in, I moved my camps to the other side of the river. Some nights, I would lurk in the shadows and watch them destroy themselves with drugs and alcohol. Many times, violence would break out, and this only reinforced my hate for them. I already saw enough of that at home, anyway. As the months passed, I moved deeper into the vast forest, always looking for a new place to explore. Summer came, and with it, more homeless. It wasn't long before they had their filthy little camps all over the woods. However, at that point, I was still safe if I stayed on my side. I was the only person who knew where to cross. River or not, my paradise would be taken away from me, once and for all by these very same people. One hot summer afternoon, I was down on the banks getting water. I had heard voices off in the distance, so was keeping my eyes peeled. I'd retrieved my water and was returning back to camp when I heard a group of people arguing on the opposite side. Curious, I hid and watched. There was a raggedy tent set up, and next to it, 3 men and 1 female yelling at one another. They were far too away for me to make out much of what was said. They all looked like they were drunk, swaying around while they argued. I stayed around for about 10 minutes when one of the men hit another over the head with a big beer bottle. The man staggered and fell to the ground. I waited for the man on the ground to move, but he did not. The assailant then picked up a big rock and threw it down on the man while the others just stood by and watched. He did this over and over, about 3 times, until he looked too exhausted to continue. I had to stifle a scream as I watched this horror unfold, and by now, was too scared to move. The female then yelled something at the man and slapped him on the chest. He looked unfazed, and instead just stared down at the mess he'd just made. After a minute of doing this, the others yelled something again at him, and they all ran away together. I could finally breathe but still dared not move, in case they returned. I stayed hidden for what seemed like hours before I decided that they weren't coming back. I expected the man on the ground to get up, but now I know how stupid that was. I got the crazy idea in my head that I needed to get him help. Drunk bum or not, he was still a human. I ran the entire 3 miles back to our apartment. For some reason, I was happy to see my father was home. I ran in short of breath and began yelling for my parents. I noticed them sitting together on the couch and ran up to them. My dad told me to shut up and then asked me what the matter was. I repeated the story of what I just witnessed in the woods. Rather than getting help, my dad began yelling at me about defying him. My slurring mom soon joined in, and they both commenced to chewing me a new hole. The worst part was when my mother accused me of making up stories to get attention. I denied this, of course, but she was not listening. The rest went the way it always did. My dad pulled off his belt and strapped me across my butt until he began crying and told me to shut up, or he'd give me something to cry about. It was clear to me after the discussion was over. The man was not getting help. After all, I was just a stupid kid. I crawled off to my bedroom and cried myself to sleep, as I had done so many times. My retreats to the woods had ended. I couldn't even leave the house without one of my folks, and going outside was out of the question. Not long after that, I was shipped off to live with my mom's dad because I'd become too much for my parents to handle. I expected life to be much more as it had before, maybe even worse. After all, there had to be a reason why my mother was so messed up. I kept my guard up for a long time, waiting for the first beating to come. Instead, I would be given a life I could have never dreamed of. Grandfather Mac turned out to be a loving and patient man, the exact opposite of any adult I'd ever met before. The first time he asked me what I'd like to do, I was speechless. No one had ever cared to ask. I swallowed the knot in my throat and told him of my love for nature. Expecting the usual laughing and mockery, I braced, but instead his face lit up. He spent the next hour telling me of all the great memories he had camping with his father. I knew then I had become the luckiest kid in the world. As soon as the springtime came, we spent every waking moment hiking the woods and parks throughout the country. The knowledge he passed on to me could fill up a library full of books. Even though he's gotten too old for us to go out together, I still visit him on a regular basis and share all the amazing adventures I have been through recently. His body may be weak, but his mind is still as strong as ever. I owe that man more than I'll ever be able to repay, and he did everything just because he loved me. It still took me a good 3 or 4 years until I summoned up the courage to tell him the story. Also, I expressed the guilt I felt for keeping it to myself all this time. I was unsure of how he'd react. At first, he sat there, quietly. A moment or two later, he sat up in his chair and hugged me tightly. This confused me, and when he let me go, I asked him what I should do. His advice to me was to contact the police back home and share the story with them. After that, the responsibility was out of my hands, and I didn't need to be guilty ever again. Once I contacted them, I washed my hands of the guilt, and now that I've grown up, I realized my parents were at fault. I did what I should have. If they chose to say nothing, it was on them. I went off to college, and upon my return at Christmas, Mac let me know that the people responsible had been found. Although all but the woman were dead, she shared the location of the man's body with detectives. They wanted to thank me for coming forward and helping them solve the case after all these years. With that, I moved on, leaving that terrible part of my life behind me. Until recently, with the death of my father, which seems to have dredged up all these old memories, I had not thought of that part of my life in some time. My love for the woods and its creatures has grown into my livelihood. Now, I get to travel all over, discovering and preserving the world's wild places before they are gone. Something I could have only dreamed of as a kid, trapped inside a rundown apartment in New Jersey, and without my grandfather's love, understanding, and teaching, none of it would have ever happened. The argument started the same way every time. You'll never catch me dead in a national park. They're full of nothing but fat tourists and RVs. I'm from the old school, and I liked it that way. Old school was kind of a description of how we camped. If it was made from anything other than canvas or leather, he considered it new-fangled junk. My mother tried on multiple occasions to introduce things as common now as nylon tents, but he wasn't having it. He'd rather carry that big, musty wall tent everywhere we camped. And don't get me started about the stinking cans of kerosene that always leaked all over everything. He was certainly a man born too late. The term roughing it had too been coined with him in mind. We'd continue to suffer through his archaic ways of experiencing the outdoors until the near death of my younger brother showed him the error of his ways. Throughout the early 80s, my father would drag us out to the national forest during Thanksgiving. The weather was relatively mild for the time of year, and the forest beautiful. I could still smell the pine trees. These retreats always seemed to coincide with the hunting season for some reason. I remember hearing my dad used to hunt before meeting our mom. I think she forbade him from doing it anymore, so this was his way of sticking it to her. Either way, gunshots near camp were a common sound. I guess because our parents grew up with very little oversight. Me and my brother Mike's childhood was the same. No one considered that it might be dangerous with a bunch of trigger-happy guys around to let 2 young boys play in the woods alone. It was normal for the 2 of us to leave camp at dawn, play all morning until lunchtime, and then go back out until supper. We'd been doing this as long as I can, and no one batted an eye. On one specific Thanksgiving, we had been running and crawling through the underbrush all day. This was during the time G.I. Joe and Rambo movies were at the height of their popularity. Mike and I loved dressing up in our camouflage clothes and playing war. Mike's birthday had been just a few days prior, and he got a pair of G.I. Joe walkie-talkies. Looking back, they were junk, but we loved them. After lunch, we returned to the woods. I can't remember exactly what I was doing at that moment, but I know Mike was trying to sneak up on me. I was sitting on a fallen tree, and suddenly heard a loud bang, quickly, followed by a whistling going by my head. I dropped flat on my stomach and waited for another shot. I wasn't sure what was happening, but something told me to stay where I was. No more than 30 seconds had passed when I heard faint moaning in the distance. Since Mike was missing at that second, I called him on the walkie-talkie. No answer, but I heard a new noise. This sounded like my name, so I called to Mike again. No answer. Now I was getting scared. Without any other ideas, I yelled out his name. I told him the game was over, and he needed to answer me. I wasn't sure if he was still trying to trick me, or was in real trouble. I listened very intently, but nothing but the faint rustle of leaves could be heard. I walked in the direction of the rustle, and listened again. Nothing. So I called out again. The rustling repeated, followed by another moan. I ran in that direction, about 20 yards, and stopped. The rustling came again, just to my right, and very close. I couldn't see anything, so I dropped to my stomach and scanned the ground. About 3 feet away, I spotted the bottom of a Nike. I knew it had to be Mike. I ran to the bush he was lying under. The sight I came upon still breaks my heart to this day. There was Mike, staring up at me with a terrified look on his face. Just under his arm was a hole with blood pouring out of it. It shocked me, but I did my best to play it cool. I didn't want to make him any more scared than he already had been. Had I been older, I may have known better to move him, but I just reached down and scooped him up in my arms. He was too heavy for me, but I was going to do my best to save him. I made it about 100 yards before I had to set him down. He must have been in considerable pain. He asked me to leave him there and go get help. His voice sounded very weak, and I almost broke into tears right there. Somehow, I held myself together and ran another mile or so without stopping. Mom must have known something was wrong. She yelled out in a panicked voice for my father. My dad came out of the tent, took one look at me, and said, "How bad is it?" I was too winded to speak. I just pointed toward where I'd set him down at, and he took off. By the time I'd caught up, Dad was already picking him up and heading for camp. The entire ride to the hospital, Mom kept talking to him, telling him to hold on. I rode in the back seat, holding my shirt against the wound the whole way there. What would have normally been at least a 30-minute drive took us just 20. Dad handed him off to the doctors. They had given him in surgery within the hour, and the next 3 were a long, living nightmare. More than shocked at what had happened to my brother, I was in amazement at how calmly my parents were handling everything. Having become a parent since, I realized they were far from calm, but they handled it well either way. It was after midnight when the doctor gave us the news. Things had been touch and go for a long time. I only found out much later that Mike had died more than once during the surgery, but Mike had a good chance of recovering completely. The police, having been notified of the shooting, arrived soon after dawn to question us. Now the urgency of the situation had passed. I broke down several times during my recollection. That was the first time I came to grips with the possibility that I could have been shot myself. Mike was going to be in the hospital for a few weeks, so my parents got a hotel room nearby. I think my father considered staying at the camp, but after a very short discussion with my mother, he decided against it. The detectives handling the case kept us up to date, but as of late as the day Mike was discharged, no names had been connected to the case. The most widely held theory is that a poacher mistook the movement in the bushes for a deer and fired. It accounts for the lack of red flags during the search through hunting licenses. It wasn't the first time this happened, and sadly, won't be the last. Mike was one of the fortunate cases, though. 34 years have passed since then, and nobody has been decisively connected to the shooting. Mike did make a full recovery, and went on to start his own business and family, just like any other normal person. Something great did actually come out of their mess. We never returned to the National Forest, and even better, Dad decided with all those fat tourists with their RVs being around, it was a safer environment for he and his family. Between 12 and 17, I got to spend my holidays in awesome places like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. This was the way I'd always thought camping should be, peaceful and quiet, and I'm almost positive Mike would agree with me. I'm not really sure who came up with the idea first, but by the day's end, we'd planned the destination and date. Although I'd been camping many times before, I'm almost positive neither Chuck nor Glenn ever had. They had come into the family late in life, and my real dad had already died by then. He had been the guy who loved camping, My stepfather, not so much. Don't get me wrong, he's a great man, but the outdoors has never been his deal. The list of supplies needed for the trip was compiled and followed to the letter, including the 4 cases of beer, perhaps the most important of all goods. We'd loaded up and were ready to leave at dawn the next morning. As we headed out, we have no idea of what lay ahead of us, and how it would affect our connection to one another, a connection we once believed to be unbreakable. 3-hour drive was uneventful and quiet. I was pleased to see how the dry surroundings were. Fire starting, while not hard for me, wasn't my strong suit, and I knew neither of my brothers had ever burned more than a cigarette. I brought along some lighter fluid just to be safe, although I never ended up needing it. While I worked on the fire, Chuck and Glenn put the knowledge they had learned watching YouTube videos to use setting up the tent. I had purposefully got the easiest tent I could find, yet it still took the better part of an hour before they had it up. The fire was already roaring by the time they joined me. I had buried the potatoes in the coals, prepared the steaks to be cooked, and was well into my second beer by then. The steaks didn't take long, and by dark, we were sitting down to a delicious meal. After dinner, the real camping began. I had chosen to camp out in the middle of nowhere on purpose. I knew we'd become obnoxious and loud when we got drunk. More importantly, I liked to make big bonfires and turn up my music loud. You can't do that with others around you. That evening turned out to be a blast. We blew through 2 cases and didn't pass out until dawn. It was something I needed to do for a long time. Despite the hangover, I resolved then and there it was something we were going to do much more often. When I finally drugged myself from my sleeping bag, it was well past noon. Chuck and Glenn were already awake, sitting next to a cold fire. They both had a beer in their hand and looked happy to see me. I asked them what was up with the fire, and Chuck mumbled something about not being able to get it relit. This made me chuckle. I walked over to the tree line and grabbed an armful of wood. When I returned, I set it down on the dead coals and blew onto them. The coals lit up brightly, and the fire was roaring again within a few minutes. Then, I went to the creek to fetch some water. The look on their faces was priceless. Chuck's jaw was hanging open, and I could tell Glenn was aching to ask me how I did it. While I waited for the water to boil, I cooked up a large mass of eggs and potatoes, and we ate breakfast with a nice cup of coffee. Once I had eaten, I was feeling much better, and suggested we go fishing. We didn't make it back to camp until almost dark. Unfortunately, no one had caught anything we could keep, but I could tell Chuck had already caught a good buzz. I cooked what was left of the steak, and after, we set to finishing what was left of the beer. This evening was much tamer than the one before. I didn't want to make a big fire. It would only be harder for me to put it out completely before we had left for home. Most of the night, the 3 of us talked about unimportant things like girls and work. Around 2 in the morning, we decided to turn in, the beer long being drunk. My last memory was Chuck going out to take a leak. He had drunk a lot more than Glenn or I. He fell several times trying to get out of his bag. He eventually made it out of the tent. I must have passed out just after that. The next thing I remember, the sun was already beginning to shine through the trees. I had to piss like crazy, so I fumbled my way to the zipper, trying not to wake the other 2 up. As I unzipped the tent, a weird burning smell, similar to burned meat, hit me. I figured one or both of the guys were already up and burning our breakfast. I looked behind me, and only Glenn was still asleep. Chuck must have been the one cooking, and he was terrible at it. I crawled out with a smirk on my face and a smart remark for him. I looked up, expecting to see my brother burning food, but was met with a sight far more serious and horrible than I could have ever imagined. The fire was burned out, and Chuck was nowhere to be seen. The dawn was still too dim to make out the large object laying across the dead coals. I walked up, within a few steps, and was hit fully by the burning smell. Then all of a sudden, it hit me what I was seeing. Chuck was lying face down across one corner of the cold fire, and he wasn't moving. Without a second thought, I grabbed his body and rolled it over. All I could see was the black and smell the terrible burning. I began yelling for Glenn, and when he did not answer immediately, I ran into the tent and shook him. He was reluctant at first, but I yelled, "Chuck's dead," loudly in his face. He jolted upright and asked me to repeat it. All I could do was point toward the manor and the remnants of the fire, and the horrible vision that the sun was making clear by the minute. He flew from the tent in one quick motion and came almost face to face with the charred body of our dead brother. I stood behind him and silently, with my eyes closed, Glenn fell to his knees and started wailing. At that second, I wanted to be anywhere but there. The sound of Glenn's haunting wails and the horrid smell permeating the air was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. A cold breeze was blowing across me, and that was when I first realized I had pissed myself. It didn't matter though. With every second, the sight became more clear, and I was too terrified to open my eyes. This was not the way I wanted to remember Chuck. I eventually crawled back into the tent and started crying myself. This continued for God knows how long, until I figured I should call 911 and let them know what had happened. They arrived about half an hour later. When the coroner left with his body, I summoned up the courage to come out. Glenn was speaking to one of the officers. The smell was still so bad. I began retching and retreated back to the tent. Soon after, another officer joined me inside the tent. We talked about the trip and the events of the night before. Nothing in particular. He left about 20 minutes later when the remaining officers. I began breaking down camp, and Glenn soon joined me. As we worked, nothing was said between us. I moved as fast as possible, hoping to soon be away from the terrible smell of my brother's burning flesh. Looking back on it, I acknowledge I may have been a bit cold and uncaring. In my defense, I was the oldest and had the responsibility of notifying the rest of the family. I knew our mother was going to be crushed, and I wanted to tell her before she heard it from the news. When it comes to Glenn, I can't speak for how he was feeling or what he was thinking. No one has the right to dictate to another how to handle their grief, especially in a circumstance such as this. Telling my mom was as bad as I imagined. She always wanted a large family. When Dad died, she thought her dream was over. However, when she met my stepfather and he mentioned adoption, she was overjoyed. Chuck and Glenn were actual brothers, about 2 years apart, and in their early teens when Mom found them. Boys their age are usually hard to adopt out, but Mom had fallen in love with them at first sight. I always considered them my blood, as did the rest of my family. Glenn and I stayed close to her for some time, knowing how hard Chuck's loss was on her. This was the first instance I began getting the feeling Glenn harbored suspicions towards me. Nothing was said, but I caught him watching me with his usual questioning look, many times throughout that month. As months had passed, more and more questions began to be raised, many more than I care to mention. I had always assumed that Chuck had passed out or tripped and fell into the fire, killing him. He had been much more drunker than us. However, when the results came back from the medical examiner, certain things were off. The bruises, for instance. Chuck's back was covered in them. The thing was, Chuck played rugby with some guys from school and had for many years. Also, his skull was fractured, a worrying sign for sure, but even the doctor was forced to admit things like this happen in a fire. The skull bursts or cracks from the heat. Horrible facts to hear, I agree, but for some reason, they have cemented the suspicions in Glenn's mind. No matter how hard I try to show him this is the wrong time to be apart, he's convinced himself I had something to do with our brother's death. I've had my own reservations towards Glenn and his relationship with Chuck. More than once, I saw them argue about something, but they stopped whenever I entered the room. Do I have my own suspicions? Yes, but now is not the time to fracture the family. Our mother needs us now more than ever, right now. If she became aware of the distrust between us, it would not only break her heart, it might just kill her. For the foreseeable future, I'm going to do my best to bring us back together. If not for our mom's sake, perhaps Chuck's. On my own, I'm going to keep digging into the rift between the two brothers and if it led to Chuck's death, even if it yields some terrible truth that I may not want to be aware of. I owe it to him. After all, Chuck was my brother, too. Every summer, for the past few years, a group of friends and I have traveled from our homes in Liverpool in the UK to Dumfries and Galloway in Scotland. Dumfries in Galloway is home to the largest continuous forest in the whole United Kingdom, Galloway Forest Park. It's about as wild as it gets for the UK, with some parts of the woods being so dense and overgrown that it's clear nobody has stepped foot in them for hundreds, possibly thousands of years. Our yearly visits brought us peace, clarity, and a respect for nature. But last year's trip ended in one of the most horrifying and distressing incidents of my entire life. One that completely changed the way I see the world and the way I consider the human mind. Year in, year out, we'd take an overnight coach up across the border, then hike out to a place called Loch Aber. The loch is a private fishing lake, supposedly reserved for members of a local fishing club who ensure that the waters are chock full of fish for them to catch, which makes it oh so easy for us to pull a quick in and out raid to catch enough of a small fish for our dinner. I'm serious. 45 minutes and we're golden, and take it from any fisherman. That is lightning speed for a half-decent catch. But last year, we decided we were tired of the same old digs and set our gazes further afield. A map told us that there was a similarly deep loch about 30 miles east known as Loch D. We figured it would be a perfect fishing spot, and we were right. Sure, it wasn't a quick fire as the private members' lake, but it came with considerably less guilt. Everything was perfect. That was until the second night, when in the middle of a campfire drinking session, one of my buddies jumped out of his seat and recoiled from the fire. "Who is that?" he asked, sort of calmly at first, nothing more than cautious confusion. "Who's who?" Someone replies lazily. "Someone moving through the trees back there." He was pointing into the trees directly behind my back. I actually gave a hoot of sarcastic laughter at first, thinking he was just trying to scare us. But the moment it became obvious that he was not messing around, a jolt of fear went through me, and I too leapt out of my seat, spun around, and shined my torch into the darkness. You could feel the tension among us rising as we desperately looked around for who might be talking about. Torch beams darted across the trees, inspecting every trunk or thicket of bushes, but there was nothing. No sign of the person my friend had seen. "Hello?" someone called out, immediately shushed by the rest of us. No one wanted to give away our position, but at the same time, we needed to know if there was anybody out there watching us. But again, nothing. Just silence. "I think you've had a bit too much to drink, mate," I remember saying to the guy who's supposedly seen a figure walking through the trees. "I'm fine. I've barely touched the bells I brought. I swear to God, I just saw somebody just then." "Like who?" somebody asked. "Man? Woman? Young? Old? What?" I don't know," he replied shakily. "But they were big. Really big. Only big thing around here is your bloody imagination. Now go and get your head down. It's been a long day." And it had, thanks to the overnight coach. Nobody really sleeps on the journey up to Scotland. I mean, they close their eyes, put some chill music through their earphones, but they never really sleep. So everyone ends up being pretty wrecked by the end of the first night. The next morning, we felt even worse. The first night after such a long journey is usually one where we sleep like the dead, but not that night. None of us could quite relax, not with the possibility of having somebody stalking us in the backs of our minds. Thank God we were planning on to fish that day, as we really were not in the mood for anything else, given how bloody exhausted we were. After breakfast, we marched down to the loch with our fishing gear. It's a gorgeous area, a crisp blue lake ringed by hills. It's not unusual to get some really nice sunny days up in Scotland too, especially during the summer. But that day, the sky was this horrible grimy gray, like the sun had barely risen at all. I was tired, half soaked from the drizzle, barely even excited to be fishing for my dinner. I I actually hoped for something exciting to happen, and for my sins, my wish came true. "Look," one of us had shouted. "Over there, other side of the lock. Can you see that thing?" It was the same lad that seen somebody or something walking through the trees. Where? We were terrified. One sighting could have been his eyes playing tricks on him. Another couldn't possibly be a mistake. "There," he said, pointing. "Just on the other side. It came out of the trees for a moment, then disappeared again. Please tell me you saw that." "Mate, just calm down. It's probably just..." "I know what I saw, and we need to get out of these bloody woods right now," he said, grabbing up his fishing gear in panic. I remember him rushing off back to camp, one of the lads following him, still trying to calm him down. But it was impossible. He was manic, scared half to death by whatever had briefly emerged from the woods on the other side of the lock. I asked the other boys if they'd seen anything. Each shook their head. None had any idea what they were talking about, but that didn't mean they were just freaked out over his outburst. We were supposed to stay for 7 full nights, but that second one was our last. We'd managed to talk to the lad who was panicking down, convince him to stay a few more nights at the very least. We'd come all this way, and I wasn't about to let one of us just leave because they'd had a wee scare or something. But it didn't end there either. In the middle of the night, the lad that had been seeing something burst out of his tent, waking each of us up before asking, "Can you hear that?" There was silence. Dead silence. I strained my ears, trying to hear what had shook him so bad. But I heard nothing. Just the rustling of a few sleeping bags as confused blokes sat up awake. He was scratching his own ears, gritting his teeth, rocking back and forth in the dirt as the sounds seemed to completely overwhelm him. That's the exact moment I realized. I think the same moment everyone else picked up on it too. That there was no noise. There was no monster. It was all in his head. He was experiencing a psychotic break, and it was all in his head. What you are about to read is a warning. I beg you, I implore you, please do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know these woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupy the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet, as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for 2 reasons. 1, animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are unknown to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife have fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And 2, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So, naturally, I started making my way back towards my car, when something real peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at the point that I'd been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid. But, thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well. But some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I'd managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic run through me. I did not recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understand how jarring that was for me, to be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just try to get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there was a ways around faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight, so that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least it usually would. Because as I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That, or the moss in this area, grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told me there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never ever seen in the woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old rundown cabin that stood before me. And I mean, it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built by any later than like 1979. So just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anybody was home, and as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I'm not entirely sure. But for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain. Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back. When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that every so often, the cabin did eventually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. Drew my attention. What I'm about to describe or attempt to describe is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statue sat atop of a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooded idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that. I ran like a scared child from that cabin and into the night. You read that right. When I walked into the cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes, at least that's what it felt like. Only when I burst through the wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're reading this, heed my warning, and do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. The scariest story I've ever heard was told to me by my grandfather. He was a soldier during the Second World War, enlisting on the day he had turned 18, March 3rd, 1944. The timing meant he missed the D-Day landings, as well as all the other horrors associated with it. But he arrived on the Western Front, just in time to take part in something arguably much worse, the invasion of the German homeland. Looking back, with the kind of 20/20 vision that hindsight gives you, it seems obvious that Nazi Germany was destined to lose the war, squeezed under the combined weights of the Allied and Soviet armed forces. But, in the moment, during the day-to-day fighting in the fields and forests of Northern Europe, the future seemed anything but certain. In fact, Germany was still convinced it could win the war. Using atomic bomb technology, stubborn defensive tactics, or a combination of the two, the Nazis were far from convinced that their fight was over. And it was into this new phase of war that my grandfather found himself, during a nightmarish push into the Nazi heartland that would prove just as terrifying as anything that had preceded it, if not more so. On the 2nd of October, 1944, the battle began. The city had been incorporated into one of the main defensive networks on Germany's western border, and the Allies hoped to capture it quickly before advocating into the industrialized basin to land the knockout blow to German manufacturing capabilities. However, a few miles south of the city lay a place known as the Hurtgen Forest. It was here that over 80,000 German soldiers were based, and the U.S. Army Task Force set into the woods intended to pin them down and prevent them from reinforcing the city. It's there that my grandfather's story occurs, so, without further ado, this is what happened to him. He and his platoon had been tasked with a routine patrol through the woods, probing for the German defensive line on which they could call in artillery and air support. It has been a quiet morning, but that calm was shattered when a distant rifle shot sent one of his platoon mates crashing into the dirt. The soldiers tried to find what little cover they could, but it took a few minutes before they could work out just which angle the shots were coming from. And in that time, 3 or 4 other Americans fell to that German sniper's bullets. A few men tried to tactfully withdraw under covering fire from their fellow soldiers. But the sniper picked them off before they could get away. Before long, the entire platoon was pinned down by the sniper, completely unable to move without being shot down where they stood. But, as horrendous as that sounds, that's not the part that stuck with him. It's what came next. The platoon's radio man had been the one shot during the initial ambush and had bled to death pretty quickly. Lying lifeless in a side clearing among the trees, anytime any of the soldiers tried to pull the man's radio unit to safety, the sniper would let off a shot, ensuring they kept their distance. One brave soul actually managed to get a hand on the radio, but through obscene skill, or just plain luck, the sniper managed to put a bullet through the upper section of the palm, basically blowing out his finger ligaments and rendering his hand useless. To their absolute horror, there was no way for any of them to call in artillery or air support. Effectively, more than 20 men were completely at the mercy of a one German sniper. My grandfather told me that on numerous occasions, a soldier might shift a little in place, maybe peek up to see if they could spot the sniper's firing position, and each time, the man would fall dead or scream out in pain as a bullet whizzed through the trees and found its mark. And each time the sniper fired and cut down another American in cold blood, he would laugh. He laughed so loud it would echo through the trees around them. My grandfather said that was the sound that he could never ever forget. Hearing the joy in that German sniper's laugh, the raw, violent delight he felt when his bullets struck home. Sometimes he would shout something, a phrase my grandfather could not understand, but had translated later on. More crying children. That sniper had my grandfather's platoon pinned down for about 6 full hours, but to him, it felt like days. They had to just lie there, perfectly still, as the dead, open eyes of their fallen comrades stared at them. Looks of shock and horror on their lifeless faces. At one point, the sniper, unable to spy any living targets through his high-powered scope, began to fire upon the dead in an attempt to break the platoon psychologically. My grandfather told me the entire platoon winced in disgust and terror as a bullet smashed into a dead man's skull. He had bled out, leaning up against a tree, and was evidently still well within the sniper's sights. Of all the wounds and injuries my grandfather saw during the war, he told me head wounds were always the worst. Once the structural integrity of the human skull is compromised, be it by bullet or shrapnel, or from the blunt force of a rifle butt, a person's face changes shape. The first bullet that hit the dead man's skull practically split it in two, right down the middle. But nothing I can write out will do exact horrific manner in which my grandfather described it. I'd known that guy for months. I could recognize him in the dark, just from his gait. But now, I didn't recognize him at all. His eyes, way too far apart. He looked inhuman. But the sniper did not stop there. He laughed and laughed and laughed as he sent 2 bullets, then 3, then 4, sailing into the dead man's skull, pulverizing it until it was just a mess of broken bone and leaking brain matter. Eyeballs still connected by the optical nerve dangled from shattered eye sockets. I can't even imagine how traumatic that must have been for a kid who was only barely 18. I mean, he was still a kid, a child. I think back to when I was 18. I could barely handle seeing a paper cut, let alone seeing somebody's entire head explode. His platoon had to wait until nightfall to escape. They did so as barks echoed through the trees. Cowards, the German sniper called them, in between volleys of that perverted manic laughter. My grandfather said he still expected to be shot as they ran back the way they came, trying not to have a head-on collision with tree trunks as they did. One man was so terrified he actually did straight run into a tree, broke his nose, but just got up and kept running. Grandfather died last year, so I consider this a little tribute to a great man who went through terrible times. Rest in peace. During my time in college, I had a friend whose dad owned an 800-acre piece of land in Texas, eastern Texas to be exact. In the past, he had leased it out to hunters and paper companies, but was no longer doing it. He had built a cabin on the land a few years before and would let us go out there from time to time and mess around. It served as a great way to relax from the pressures of school and get closer to nature. The spring break of 1997, we loaded up our trucks and headed for the cabin. Our plans were to shoot guns, drink, and other things rednecks like us to do in the woods. Our first morning kept us busy, cleaning the cabin and moving all of our stuff inside. Around dinner time, we made a big fire outside and cooked a bunch of steaks and fried potatoes. We skipped dessert and broke open some beers. The sun went down not long after, and for the remainder of the evening, we got loaded and passed around a joint or two. At some point in the night, I heard a shuffling noise outside and went out to check on it. The fire was barely burning at that point, and just outside of its light, I swore I could see the shape of a man standing completely still. From what I could tell, he was facing me, perhaps waiting to see what I'd do. I blinked my eyes real hard to get a clearer look, but my position and the lack of light made it too hard to see clearly. The shape continued to stand still, So I decided I'd walk up a little closer in hopes of getting a better picture. The thought terrified me, but I was transfixed by the being. Or perhaps I was still too intoxicated to make a wise decision. I took 2 steps forward, but was distracted by a voice behind me. My friend had woken up and noticed the door was wide open. So he got out of bed and saw me walking around the fire. His voice caused me to jump a little, but I soon realized who was speaking. I asked him if he saw the figure on the other side of the fire pit. He just laughed at me and said I must be stoned. I was seeing things. We laughed it off and returned to bed. On my way, I turned back to take one more look, but the shape was no longer there. I chuckled to myself and went back to sleep. The next morning, I wrote the whole experience off as the result of too much fun and went on with my day. We spent the first half of it fishing at the big pond. Post-lunch was shooting guns and one guy's compound bow that he had just bought. The beers and smoke were broke out after dinner. A game of poker was attempted but soon canceled in favor of another evening telling lies around the fire. On one of my many trips to relieve myself that night, I was spooked by the sound of a stick breaking close by, and noped it back to the fire. The look of fear on my face made the other guys laugh their butts off. I tried to explain what happened but was quickly reminded that we weren't the only creatures in the woods. The reasoning seemed sound, so I accepted it. Not long after, we were standing around, involved in some deep discussion, and I turned to speak to the guy on my left. What I saw caused me to clench up so tight I could have snapped a steel rod with my sphincter. Standing within a few steps behind my friend was another man I did not recognize. It was like he appeared out of nowhere. What made it creepier was that he was staring intently at the back of his head, almost like he was trying to bore through it with his eyes. I remained frozen stiff. The longer I looked at him, I realized he was the same being I saw lingering outside the light of the fire the night before. He was average height with a long, unkempt beard. My friend continued rambling about whatever, unaware of his shadow. After several long seconds, the stranger turned to me with a blank expression and walked away. This was when my friend finally noticed my horrified look. When he spoke, the thrall of fear was released, and I began pointing and rambling about what I had just witnessed. He and my other friend laughed at me again. There was no way I was seeing things this time. I described the man, and one of them suggested he was a Bigfoot. Despite my protests, nobody was buying it, and I eventually just cut my losses and shut up. However, I wasn't beat. Their mockery had made me even more determined to prove the stranger's existence. The next 2 days were quiet. No stranger. In other words, but I kept my eyes peeled for anything out of the ordinary. By our 5th morning, I was beginning to question my sanity. I'd seen this mysterious being stalking around us twice, and now it had suddenly disappeared. I resolved to put my quest on the back burner until some new evidence rose. My friend's dad had mentioned to him an owner of one of the surrounding properties had spotted a small group of wild hogs running through his land. So we grabbed our rifles and went on the search for him. 1 mile or so down on one of the property's many roads, we came across some hog wallows and knew we were on the scent. We went up the road, now on foot, tracking them. Another mile on, we stumbled upon 3 large hogs rooting up the ground and prepared to make bacon. 2 of us chambered around as quiet as possible on our rifles and took aim. I was less than a second from saying 3 and pulling the trigger when the loud crack of another rifle filled the air, followed closely by a burst of wood and bark above my friend's head. It took a moment for it to register. We were being shot at. A few seconds later, another crack and strike. This time even closer. We weren't going to wait for a third. The friend who appeared to be the target led us down a side trail that led back to the cabin. No more shots followed as we fled. However, instead of finding safety at the camp, the shots began again. Seeing no other option, we hopped into my truck and hauled out of there. This was a time just before the commodity and commonality of cell phones, so we had to drive the 20 miles to town to get help. After we explained the situation, we returned to the property a few hours later with some deputies. We approached slowly and remained in the cars when we parked. We waited to see if the shots would start again, but nothing. A cursory look around counted 3 holes in the cabin and another 2 in my buddy's windshield. Perhaps the worst part was that all of our camping stuff, sleeping bags, and such were spread out all over the ground. Luckily, we'd smoked all the weed the night before. Nothing was missing but a box of ammo, and strangely, my sleeping bag and a wool blanket. A theory began to form in the deputies' minds that we had stumbled upon a squatter or poacher camping out on the property, for whatever reason. They acted as if they were going to let it go, but once my friend's dad, who owned the land, heard about it, he put pressure on them to start a search. This was about the time I repeat my story of seeing somebody lurking around the cabin. No one was laughing now, and my story was finally being taken seriously by somebody. The search was led around the property by my friend's dad. School had already begun again by this time it took place. It continued for a full week, but nothing other than a few old camps were found. It was assumed that he knew the heat would be on him after the shooting incident, and he moved on. During the course of the investigation, several avenues were followed to ID the stranger, like escaped cons, but he remains unidentified to this day. Because of the chance of another attack, our trips to the property ended. The next year, we tried to camp out somewhere else, but it wasn't the same, and our nature getaways died out. Within 5 years, my friend's dad had a heart attack and lost interest in the cabin. The paper company's lease was renewed, and the land's trees have been used to make paper and pulp wood products ever since. Each time I jot down a quick note, I'm reminded of our awesome trips, and especially the odd and terrifying week that caused them to stop. I do once or twice a year talk to my old college friend on the phone. As far as he's heard, that crazy stranger still has not been caught. We sometimes theorize as to his origins and where he may have ended up. I, however, often take this much further when I'm alone. I wonder why our so-called strangers seem to focus so much of his anger onto my friend. And perhaps, far more concerning, is he still out there, waiting for his chance to finish what he began all those years ago?